Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. Two Israeli educators are going to tell us about the conflict between their country and Palestinians in a way that we hardly ever hear. What do schools in Israel teach children about Palestinians and about their history and their culture? And how has that shaped and maybe even fueled the conflict between them, not just today, but over the past 75 years? Daniel Bar-Tal, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I am very happy to join.
And Nimrod Tal, I hope I pronounced that right. Welcome to you too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let me introduce you more fully. Daniel Bar-Tal was for many years a psychology professor at Tel Aviv University. He has done a lot of research on Israeli education and how Palestinians are portrayed. And Nimrod Tal, you're a history professor. You were at Tel Aviv University and now at the Kibbutzim College of Education. They're both speaking to us from Israel. Danny and Nimrod, and I'm referring now to our guest, Danny Bar-Tal. We got another Danny. It's going to be
confusing,
but we'll try to sort it out. You've both written widely about how Israelis and Palestinians grow up learning clashing narratives about each other. It's at the heart of the conflict in a certain way. You know, my years spent in your part of the world as a New York Times correspondent taught me how much people can be imprisoned by history. In fact, both sides, it seems to me, from my experience there, are dramatically invested in conflicting stories that are really hard to reconcile. And in general, neither side recognizes how the other has suffered.
But Nimrod Tal, you did a remarkable project last year to try to change that in a small way. You taught Israeli students about events in their history that most Israelis never learned or learned much about. And these were events that show how both Israelis and Palestinians have suffered. And you found that as a result, your students began seeing Palestinians in new ways. So here's my question. If all Israeli schools and teachers did that, could it help change the mindset of Israelis just enough to make them more open to working toward a peaceful relationship with Palestinians?
The short answer is yes. When I do it with my students, when they encounter history in a different way, you can definitely see some change in their perspectives, in their ability to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yes, it will help, but I think that the key word that in your question was, would that be enough? It will definitely make a change, but I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be enough.
And we're going to get into the details of your project a bit later. But first, Dave.
The way societies teach history is key to understanding how each side sees the conflict. So I think we ought to summarize as neutrally as possible how Israel was born in 1948. And then we'd like you to explain what Israeli children actually learn about that history, which is not always the same as what nonpartisan historians have written. Okay, so let me do this. Try to do it concisely. Here's a thumbnail sketch of what happened. After World War II and the Holocaust, the United Nations proposed dividing the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jews accepted the partition plan, but the surrounding Arab countries rejected it, and so did Palestinian Arabs who were living on that land.
Now, even before 1948, there had been a low-level war between Jews and Arabs for some time. It was what they called a communal war, which means not between armies, but between ethnic groups. Both sides committed massacres. Then, after Israel declared independence, a full-scale war broke out as Arab armies attacked from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. Here's a newsreel.
In the year of independence, fighting was fierce in the Negev desert area. Here, Israeli troops routed the Arabs and took hundreds of prisoners. The new government, headed by David Ben-Gurion, is installed in Tel Aviv. Thus, for the first time since the Roman legion destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, the Jewish people have a nation of their own.
And about 750,000 Palestinians left or expelled the area and moved to Syria, to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Egypt. Gaza Street was populated by these refugees. And in Israel only remained 150,000 Palestinians. 150,000 Palestinians were in Israel in 1949, put in the military state. So they could not move from one settlement to another. They were guarded, controlled until 1966. Only in 1966, the military regime was cancelled. Okay, so background for your listeners.
And how that seminal event is taught and understood is a key element in the clashing narratives of the two sides. Let me add here that we hope to find some Palestinian educators or researchers who will join us in the future to discuss these issues from their perspective and what Palestinian schools teach. Not so easy to find people brave enough to speak up about this now. But today, we're going to focus on how Israel teaches its citizens to view Palestinians and history.
You know, narratives of the conflict and about each side are very critical parts of the conflict. You have to understand that each side tries to socialize the people that will support the conflict, will be mobilized for the conflict, and will be ready to kill and be killed.
So you're saying that Israeli schools have taught a narrative that was basically designed to prepare citizens to be willing to fight?
This is really the goal of narrative in the conflict. When we talk about a conflict that goes on more than 100 years, very vicious wars and violent encounters, most of the time, Israelis, the government, had to prepare the Israelis to the conflict, to teach them about patriotism, about self-sacrifice, about being victim, about dehumanization of Palestinians.
Oh, the dehumanization of Palestinians.
It was extremely important in order to maintain the conflict. So when I grew up, it was a period of really intractable conflict, and it was not education, it was indoctrination.
What you just called indoctrination, historians often call the master narrative, right? I mean, that's the narrative that pretty much anybody in any given country learns about their own history. And Danny, you've been writing about it through your career, including in your book called Sinking in the Honey Trap, the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, what was the master narrative that each of you learned when you were growing up in different eras? Nimrod.
I think it's quite difficult to put it in a sentence or two because it's quite complicated in a sense. But the big story is that the Jews once lived in the land of Israel in biblical times, and they had their national sovereignty, and that was like the golden age. And then they were expelled and lived for 2,000 years in exile. And then, following the lead of the Zionist movement, they returned to their homeland. And now it gets tricky because I think at the very beginning, so late 40s, 50s, it was taught as if the Jewish people returned to a nomad country, like no man's land. It was completely barren country. No one lived here, like a virgin land. And with time, it changed. Textbooks started to discuss the people who lived here, but not in a sense that went all the way to the point of, all right, so if there were people here, what happened to them? Were they expelled, or did they run away? You asked me to describe the Zionist master narrative, and I think it's quite complex. And the motive of the few against the many is a fundamental basic element of the narrative. And there are several others, like from exile back to the homeland. And we were always persecuted by and for our religion. It's always the Jewish view against the masses, the many. In the Middle Ages, it was the Christian world, and afterwards it was the Muslim world and the Arab world. So it's a recurring motive.
And these echoes of history reverberate into the present, obviously. So the continuing conflict is in harmony with that whole narrative, which is not a false narrative, actually. But it certainly reinforces a difficulty, an inhibition in seeing the other as having a viewpoint or having also the role of victims. I mean, I remember one Israeli telling me, I don't think it was you, Danny, but somebody else, that the Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs are both victims. And when you put two victims together, it's like mixing fire and kerosene.
Right.
Because the Palestinians see themselves as victims too.
Right.
Danny, you grew up during and after the 1948 war, and you did a major study some years ago to find out exactly how have Israeli textbooks portrayed Palestinians since then, and how have Palestinian school books portrayed Israelis?
It's a fascinating study, which you were commissioned to do by a religious council that represents Christians and Muslims and Jews. And your co-author was a Palestinian professor.
Yes, this is the time of President Bush. He tried to advance in some way a peace resolution. So he decided that one way is to do it through religious leaders. So he invited, Condoleezza Rice actually did it.
She was the Secretary of State.
And she invited religious leaders from Christian domination and from Muslim domination and from Jewish domination, the chief rabbis. So she said, okay, let's do the study about the textbooks and let's see what Palestinian textbook teach and what Israeli books teach. And they hired me as an Israeli representative and Professor Sami Edwan as a representative of Palestinian books.
And he was from Bethlehem University, is that right? On the West Bank.
Yeah.
And you looked at school books from the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way to, when you were doing the study in the early 2000s. And you had this very rigorous way of analyzing the texts to understand what images about Palestinians do Israeli books give, and also what images about Israelis do Palestinian books give. What do Israeli kids and Palestinian kids grow up thinking and feeling about the other?
And we started to work, assembled a team, 18 supervisors, hired from all over the world to supervise how the study is carried. And it was really pain in the neck to work under this condition because they were really very involved in each step of the study. I mean, I hated do study like this.
You mean too many cooks spoil the broth?
Too many, right, cooks. And we hired eventually a firm in Texas that was able to analyze the textbooks through computer. It was the first time. And I think that it was the most elaborate study ever done on textbooks.
So let's summarize what you found. First, we should stress that there are three main kinds of schools in Israel, and you found that textbooks in each of those school systems portrayed Palestinians and history in different ways.
Okay, Israel has government-run non-religious schools, right? Those are secular schools.
Right,
Then Israel has religious schools.
religious.
And then there's the ultra-Orthodox, super religious schools.
Yeah, very, very different. So there are many streams within ultra-Orthodox. You know, each Hasidic group has own books. So it was very, very difficult study, first to find the books, to buy the books, and analyze the books. It is very difficult to do.
Danny, let me read from your English conclusions in your study. You found that both sides present unilateral national narratives that depict the other as the enemy and selectively present historical events to reinforce their own narratives. There is a significant lack of information in the books about the other's religion, culture, and daily life, which serves to delegitimize the other's presence. And you also found that negative biases are more pronounced in the ultra-Orthodox Israeli books and the Palestinian books compared to the government books. But then you had some really fascinating phrases. Shall I read a few of them here?
Yeah.
For example, you found in Israeli books that they would talk about an Arab village that had always been a nest of murderers. They had phrases like the masses of the wild nation, referring to Palestinian. When they talked about a convoy of Arabs, it was a convoy of bloodthirsty Arabs.
You know, for American listeners, it might be worthwhile drawing the parallel, which struck me too when I was going through this in my work there, of the way Arabs were portrayed, not just in textbooks, but also in literature for children, and the way Native Americans in the United States were portrayed. Savages, even the noble savage, the very close parallel.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah.
And what struck me about your report is that this wasn't just books from the 1950s and 60s. There were these phrases in books still being used in Israeli schools in the early 2000s when you did this study.
Yeah, but what you read was found in the books used by ultra-Orthodox community. They consist today about 12% of the Jewish population.
Although here's a quote from a 10th grade state secular school book. Masses of armed Arabs surrounded blah, 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 and wanted to enter by cunning. And I could go on and read more from what you found from these state secular textbooks. Here's a quote, an incited Arab mob. Maybe it's not as extreme as the ultra-Orthodox books, but, still.
I spent a lot of time on studying this problem of perception of Arabs in the elementary school and high school. The socialization does not begin in high school. I studied children in kindergarten. And already in kindergarten begins the indoctrination. In kindergarten, age 4, 5, learn about Israeli holidays. In each of them, many of them, or each of them, that they celebrate, commemorate, Jews are presented as victims that the other side tries to exterminate. Hanukkah, Greeks. Purim, Persians. Pesach, Passover, Egyptians. The Holocaust Day, Nazi Germany. Then it comes to Independence Day, Arabs. So a kid like my kid came and say, Dad, I don't understand. What does it mean? That from every generation, they try to kill us all, the Jews. So this is type of socialization that goes on today. And how we can win? With the army, the strong army. Soldiers come to kindergartens, many kindergartens, during the Independence Day and other days, and are presented as the defenders of the state today. So here you have already a very basic story where you have sense of collective victimhood and the army which is already glorified as a mean to defend us. And also you have dehumanization of Arabs very much. And already in elementary school and even in kindergarten, we studied with very different methods, like drawings. Please draw an Arab and draw a Jew. You should see, I can show you here the books that came out of this research. The Arabs are drawn with horns.
Arabs with horns.
As devils.
Devils.
Yeah, this is the way that they are perceived.
Well, just to remind everybody, we are speaking to two Israeli professors who have studied education and taught teachers, future teachers. Daniel Bar-Tal was for years a psychology professor at Tel Aviv University, and Nimrod Tal was a history professor at Tel Aviv University and now teaches at the Kibbutzim College of Education.
Okay, we've been talking about how Israelis learn to perceive Palestinians, really, how to feel about Palestinians. But there's another aspect of the ways that Israeli school books have socialized and indoctrinated students. And those are your words, Danny, socialized and indoctrinated. And I'm referring to what schools teach about the country's history. What events do students learn? What events are left out or whitewashed? And maybe one way to analyze that is by noting that Israelis have a joyous celebration every spring, Independence Day. But for Palestinians, it's a time of mourning. They call it Nakba.
Let me stop you there for a second, Danny, and just explain to our listeners. First of all, Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. It's what the Palestinians call what Israel celebrates, its war of independence. So let me just tell you a quick story, if I can make it short, about my own experience with this. When I arrived in Israel in 1979, I got a call from a man who turned out to be the translator of Yitzhak Rabin's memoirs, Peretz Kidron. And at this point, Yitzhak Rabin had been prime minister. Later, he again became prime minister. But at this juncture in 1979, he was a member of the opposition. He had written his memoir, and under the Israeli law, any former government official had to submit manuscripts to a censorship committee headed by the justice minister for, vetting. Well, his translator, who called me, was very upset because a section of the memoir had been deleted by the censorship committee in which Rabin himself described expelling Palestinians from two towns near Tel Aviv, Lod and Ramleh. He was involved in it. He and the future foreign minister Yigal Allon and the future president David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion ordered the Palestinians to be expelled. That was censored.
And excuse me, Dave, why was that such a key point?
It was a key point because at that point, the kind of official Israeli story was that Palestinians were not deliberately expelled during the war. Those who fled the fighting the way everybody, people do during a war, or they were told by Arab leaders to leave and then they could come back after victory and that sort of thing. And
in my time, when someone was talking in the 50s about expulsion of Palestinians in Nakba, was fired from the Hebrew University.
And what you just said, Danny Bar-Tal, about being fired for mentioning that is an illustration of the tight clamp that was put on that particular part of history. I had to go to Rabin to find out whether this was true because I didn't know the translator. Did he really write this in his manuscript? And he said, well, I can't talk about it. The censor took it out. I said, why do you think the censor took it out? And he said, I don't know. I was surprised. Bingo, I had the confirmation. So the New York Times published the whole section of the censored material, which was not officially approved in courses and textbooks at that time. But several years later, an Israeli journalist and became a historian, Benny Morris, mined the declassified documents from that period from the foreign ministry and documented in a very detailed book how many Palestinians were deliberately expelled from which villages and so forth. So to what extent today do students learn that some Palestinians, not all who left were expelled, but quite a few were actually deliberately expelled? To what extent do students learn that in Israel?
Again, the short answer is that we don't learn a lot about it, barely nothing. The word Nakba perhaps appears in textbook, but perhaps not, maybe not even once, but maybe once or twice. It's not a lot.
Just want to mention that there is a law in Israel that you don't mention Nakba in formal institutions of the government. So the schools are really part of this institution.
So that story, that complicated story of some Palestinian Arabs fleeing the fighting, some being deliberately expelled,
some being massacred,
do not get reflected in the textbooks, in the curriculum, do you think? They're not there?
They're not there. Again, not entirely. There's been some change. I wouldn't say improvement because it goes back and forth. And maybe it's important to say that the history curriculum in Israel has a history.
Has its own history.
Exactly.
And Danny Bar-Tal, you were part of that back and forth another time when government officials decided to change how they teach history. This time it was back in the mid-1990s.
Yeah, it was 1993. When it looked as if Israelis and Palestinians might be moving toward peace, when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat agreed to what was called the Oslo Accord.
It was nothing short of breathtaking. Two veteran warriors of Middle East battlefields joining a young American president in the first step toward peace. It was a day of unbelievable moments. Yasser Arafat, an honored guest at the White House, clearly relishing his new legitimacy. Arab diplomats greeting Israeli leaders for the first time. And at Arafat's instigation, a handshake between two men who had been bitter enemies for decades.
And there was an
Presiding over
understanding
this
after those
stunning
accords that Israelis and Palestinians should revamp the way they teach their citizens about each other. They should stress tolerance and coexistence and lead toward a peaceful future.
And Danny Bar-Tal, Israel's education minister, came to you and said, we want you to help design the strategy for how to do this.
Yeah.
And you prepared these sweeping proposals for how Israeli schools and other institutions could revamp the way they teach about Israeli-Palestinian history to really open people's minds to the facts.
Exactly. And when I came home, I felt that it's an immense task where you were rearing up children from age 5 to 18 to hate Palestinians, to label them as new Nazis, and suddenly you have to turn it over and teach children, adolescents, that there is a possibility to make peace with them. So this was a challenge, very, very big to do it.
But then Netanyahu came to power for the first time, and your project was killed.
Yeah, absolutely. So it started in 1994. The elections were in 1996. Netanyahu won the election, and the new minister, who was from Religious Zionist Party, called me and said, your project is finished.
And it's interesting because I studied history in school when Danny was in this committee trying to think about what textbooks should say and what they should have in them in order to contribute to some sort of settlement or even peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It was early 90s. And so we start to hear a bit more of Palestinian history and Palestinians, about these people. We didn't hear about the Nakba or the Kfar Qasim massacre, but we hear some new things, I think, that weren't there perhaps a decade or two beforehand. But nowadays, they are no longer there again. So in a sense, I think, the 90s were kind of this moment when peace and some kind of dialogue between Israeli and Palestinians was possible, and it trickled down to history education as well. But unfortunately, it's no longer the case. Peace has been completely pushed, marginalized, pushed away out of the discourse, and it's
pushed out of the curriculum.
Yeah.
And Nimrod, now we come back to your remarkable project that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode that maybe could help bring Israelis and Palestinians together in some way. If only your idea would catch on and spread. Last year, you taught a class of roughly a dozen history teachers in training, and really interesting, you exposed them to two traumatic historical events that most Israeli students don't ever study.
One of those events was a trauma against Palestinians, and the other was a trauma against religious Jews. Although before we hear about the events themselves, what were you thinking when you came up with this risky-sounding project? I mean, you did this after the Hamas invasion and massacres in October 2023.
My project, my research is really the conflicting narratives in Israel, to see how these narratives are being told and advanced, in communities, in different populations, and see how and why they collide with other narratives. So I said, all right, let's do a course about conflicting narratives. I think that history teachers or future history teachers can be interested in this kind of knowledge, knowing that there are other narratives, and maybe they can use it, bring to class other points of view. When I planned this course, it was in the summer, so before the Hamas attack on October 7th. And afterwards, I decided to go on with the project because I thought that either it's not the time to talk about these kind of things, like completely forget all about it, or it's really the most appropriate time to do so. And it can be meaningful just because now we see what does it mean to live in a conflict.
And what was your goal? What were you hoping would happen?
I was hoping, actually, my expectations were, in a sense, kind of low, but at the time I thought it's more than enough. I was hoping that my students would be able to listen, just to listen, not to do anything else, not to accept, not to understand, not to empathize, not to learn, really just to be there, just to listen.
Okay, so you took your students to two dramatically different museums.
One of them involved the Arab village, the Israeli Arab village of Kfar Qasim. There was an incident there, a massacre, that took place in the 1950s during this period that Danny described, where there was a military authority over Arabs. So tell us what happened.
So as you said, and as Danny said before, after the war of 1948 and up until the 1960s, so 1966, much of the Arab population, or many or most of the Arab settlements were put under military authority. That meant that the military officer decided about their ability to move, work, and basically do anything. I mean, the military controlled basically every aspect of the civil life of the Palestinians in those settlements. And Kfar Qasim was one of these villages, and
they were Israeli citizens, correct?
They were Israeli citizens, yeah.
So they were not. We're not talking about the the West Bank or Gaza
No,
were later on under occupation. They were citizens of Israel.
exactly. This was one of part of the population, the Palestinian population, who stayed within the borders of Israel after the 48 war. And on October 29th, 1956, the massacre happened. There was a curfew. There was always a curfew in Kfar Qasim, and the curfew hour was moved from, I think it was 7 to 5. Either way, it was put on an earlier time. And some of the workers who worked outside the village were unaware that the curfew was moved 2 hours earlier. And when they returned, a force of the Israeli military border police, and the border police is part of the military, stopped them and committed a vicious massacre of 49 women, kids, and like ordinary civilians. The death toll was 49, and there were several, waves of the massacre. So 49 is really just the awful bottom line of a more complex and even more vicious event, but that's the basic story.
But of course, the eventual story got more complicated. Some Israeli soldiers who took part in the massacre were put on trial and convicted, but the government reduced their sentences. Nobody served more than 3.5 years. Also, Israeli officials initially blamed the massacre on rogue soldiers, but then it turned out that the orders really came from higher up. In any case, you found that most students in Israel don't learn about it.
And it's quite astonishing. I learned that in my school, I went through archival material and I saw that in my school, just a year after I graduated, 2 teachers realized that their students don't know anything about the massacre. And they said, well, how come they don't know anything? And they looked in the books and they said, well, of course, it's not there.
Okay, so then you took your students to another museum,
Mm-hmm.
which tells the story of an Israeli community that was destroyed roughly 20 years ago.
It was.
Right. There was a very different set of Israeli leaders back then, not as extremist as now.
Yeah.
And the prime minister then, Ariel Sharon, who was essentially a military man who thought as a military man, saw the Gaza Strip as more of a military liability than as an asset. So he ended their military occupation of Gaza. And before the army withdrew, he ordered soldiers to forcibly evict almost 10,000 religious Jews from their settlements in Gaza, an area called Gush Katif.
In an unprecedented decision, Israel dismantled 4 settlements in the West Bank and ceded control of the entire Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. Welcome to Gush Katif, a block of land containing most of the 21 Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. Inside Gush Katif is Neve Dekalim, meaning palm tree oasis. It is the largest and most populous Jewish
for the religious Zionist community, and again, when I say the religious Zionist community, it's kind of a gross generalization because it's quite a complex and multi-layered community, fascinating in its own right. But generally speaking, the evacuation became seen and experienced as a trauma, a real traumatic event that ever since has been, brought up time and again in different contexts and for different reasons.
An expulsion of a different kind by their own people.
Exactly. There is a research that showed that the sort of disengagement from Gaza, as it's been called in Israel, is kind of being seen by many in the religious Zionist community as a turning point in their master narrative. They were kind of the essence of what being a Zionist is, to settle in remote places and work the land and fight in the army, and the essence of what being Zionist is. All of a sudden, they were portrayed by their own country as, as a problem, even as traitors. So it's traumatic.
Yeah, they saw themselves as the spearhead of the highly noble and moral purpose, in a way.
I think so. And for these people, it's a trauma.
And this story was also not something that your students, college students at that point, had known?
No, because as Danny said before, the Israeli education system is divided into streams. But basically, in the Zionist religious Zionist education system, you would hear probably more about it. In the state secular system, much less so. And that's important for me because I want to see this event, this trauma, through their eyes.
So there you are exposing these young history teachers in training to two events that they know little about. One is where the Israeli soldiers massacred Palestinians. Another is where Israelis themselves were ousted from their homes.
By Israeli soldiers, by the way.
So two versions of victimhood. And we want to hear what some of the students said in their evaluations about this course. But first, Danny Bar-Tal, and you've been very patient, Danny. Danny, was this a risky project for Nimrod to embark on, especially right after the Hamas massacre, to expose people to different narratives?
In my view, it was a very dangerous project, especially the one that you take people to Kfar Kasem.
To the village where the Palestinians were massacred.
Because some of them could call member of Knesset and accuse you of being anti-Israeli, being anti-Semite, etc. But you have teachers that are very brave and see the role that they have to tell the Israeli students in high school the real story. So some of them are called and reprimanded by the Ministry of Education, but most of them go with the wind and don't want to have troubles.
You know, one of you, and I don't know if it was you, Danny, or you, Nimrod, mentioned an example of an Israeli history teacher who suggested in a Facebook group that although it's not written in most history textbooks, Israeli Defense Forces committed crimes throughout Israeli history, massacring Palestinian civilians. And he was arrested, right?
A long time ago, yeah.
He was arrested for disturbing the public peace. And then you write, upon his return to school, he was met with scorn and protest by students and parents and politicians.
Well, you remember that a Palestinian professor at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, Mohammed Dajani, some years ago taught a course on the Holocaust and took Palestinian college students to Auschwitz. And he was vilified, threatened, in the end had to leave the university. On the other hand, about 10 years ago, I met a history teacher in Jerusalem in a high school who told me that her students actually had pushed her to give them readings written by Arabs during the 48 War because they didn't feel they were getting that perspective. So she was able to do that thanks to the internet. And she didn't get into any trouble. But Nimrod, did you have any pushback when you did this project?
Actually, not at all. No, it wasn't always easy.
Then what did the students say to you in the end?
Basically, they felt that it's an important experience, even if it's not an easy one, even made them angry or uncomfortable. Nonetheless, bottom line is that it's important and it's good that we did it.
And please read some of their actual words, because you in your report, you quote quite a few of the students.
Yeah, sure. One of them said, and I quote here, "I felt anger about the way the story of Gush Katif was told, as well as pain about the personal experience and feelings. It was a roller coaster. Excitement and high expectations turned into sadness, anger, and feeling of guilt," end quote. Another quote was, "Hearing about the massacre in Kfar Kasem from the other side, when we ourselves experienced such a tragedy, was surprising. I am surprised at myself for being able to contain and set aside the pain for a moment and empathize with their pain."
With the Palestinians' pain.
Wow, boy, that's powerful. Woo.
And I'm really privileged to have these students and to be there with them. And I really am in awe of what they did, even just going ahead with the course and feeling this and being able to report this.
One of the comments, Nimrod, that jumped out at me was one of the young history teachers saying, I thought to myself that for the first time, I truly succeed in partially understanding the sadness and anger of the Arab, Israeli, and even the Palestinian public.
Yeah, I think it's quite astonishing, and it's really, yeah, it's really exciting. And perhaps just to add to that, the encounter with someone else's troubled past or traumas did not in the end move the students just to accept new knowledge uncritically. One of them said they tried to maintain a critical ear.
Maintain a critical ear, yeah.
Yeah, and I also gave myself homework to examine different opinions and statements from different perspectives. Another said, the main thing I learned from the course is the realization that there is a lot of information I don't know, and I always need to approach learning with curiosity and openness.
Well, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Many of them felt that as teachers, they would like to take these stories and this approach of others' traumas and others' narratives to their own classrooms in the future. And one of them said, for instance, I would like my students to recognize all the complexities. And another one said, the goal of history teaching should be delve into the complexity of the narrative and recognition of the painful past of other to understand the complex and sometimes painful present reality. And I think complexity is the key word here. I did not want them to to learn someone else's narrative. I don't think that in these museums you can learn about the narrative of the others, but you can learn that there is another narrative and that there is a complex reality, past, present, and future, and this complexity is important. And I think this is the most the greatest thing that I could give them.
Well, you said it in the beginning by calling this a course on listening.
Exactly.
Which is so important. Wow. A question arises in my mind of what these teachers will face in their classrooms when they try to apply their critical thinking and get the students to do it, because it'll be a different atmosphere in some schools, I think, and maybe not quite as accepting. In your case, you teach all of this in the middle of a reality that the conflict continues.
Of course, of course.
And there are lots of forces on young people's minds besides those from textbooks or teachers. So a question arises, how important is it what kids learn in school? Can that really shape their views going forward? I mean, I'll just give you a little bit of an example of this. Back when I was living there from 79 to 84, the Van Leer Institute did a program of curriculum on Arab culture that was an elective in some high schools. And part of it involved both Arab and Israeli students meeting each other, visiting each other's schools, and so forth. And they did a little survey of the Israeli students before the course and then right after the course, and found that the results were rather dramatic. That is, as your students, Nimrod, these high school kids changed a lot of their views about Arabs. They became less prejudiced, you could say, less bigoted. But then they went back to the students a year or two later, and they found a lot of backsliding. That living in the society, seeing the conflict all around them, it was difficult for them to sustain the levels of tolerance that they had acquired in this curriculum. So that's the question. How effective and how important is it for schools to teach in the way they should teach?
I think that really goes back to a question from the beginning of our talk. Is it enough? I don't think it's enough. I don't think education can solve all the problems, or even just teaching history in a new, different way will change students and later on grown-ups' point of view forever, completely. Again, we live in a specific, very difficult reality, and I think that there are a lot of things that influence how they see and how they understand the past, the present, and the future. But I think that's what we can do and what we should do. And that brings me back to why I did this course. I think that's why we should do specifically right now. I think because, if we won't do anything now, if we won't do anything, we will just go further down and down and down and down. And what we can do is for each of us, and that's why I wake up and go to work every morning, to try to push it back a little bit, push against reality in a sense, to make a different future a possibility.
So the good teachers are really swimming upstream against a whole huge environment of stereotyping and hatred.
Giving you example, you go to Israeli media today, which are very biased. They present the Israeli narrative. It's not all. There are some journalists that try to present the complex narrative, as Nimrod was saying. But many of them really turn to the right. You have to know that about 65% of the Jewish population are rightist. The younger generation is more religious and more nationalistic, more hawkish. And the government has own channel 14, that presents only and only the Israeli narrative, and they call today Arabs Nazis, terrorists. This is a common label to the Gazan people. And today, the government tries to silence voices that present it in more complexity and critically. The government tries to silence the academia, the school, in order to present a very different picture that is one-sided and black and white picture. And we are in the middle of struggle for openness, criticism. This is really the struggle of Israel today.
And Danny, you told me when we first chatted on the phone that there's still another way that the Israeli government continues to spread the master narrative. And for some reason, I find this one especially surprising. Maps. You see maps hanging on walls all over Israel that do not show the Palestinian territories. They don't show Gaza. The maps don't show the green line that separates Israel from the West Bank. Instead, you say the maps show that all the land is Israel, period. And there's no Palestinian territory.
Yes. My granddaughter goes to kindergarten. She's 5 years old. In the entrance of the kindergarten, there is a big, big map. The map is without the Palestinian, marking the Palestinian.
Is this part of an official Israeli government policy to have maps of this kind in the schools?
Right. The girl goes every day and sees the map. The mindset is built.
I've seen maps on the West Bank and Palestinian schools that show also no green line. So it's all Palestine, no Israel. So both sides use maps to their advantage.
We all know, of course, that somebody, at least one person, is going to hear this conversation and say, I can't believe you guys are so anti-Israel. So what would you answer them?
I'm totally for Israel as a country, democratic, pluralistic, liberal country where people, young, adult, everyone, no matter where they come from, who they are, can think freely and critically. They can think.
And when you're talking about a pluralistic democracy, that's very pro-Israel.
That's why I think my biggest success, if I can say so, in this course was that students didn't learn specific piece of history or specific evidence or a fact. They learned that the story is complex and they should keep on thinking independently, freely, and they should always fight for the right to think critically and openly and independently. And that's the country I want to live in. And Israel, I think, could be this country. I mean, we should make it a country like this.
Nimrod Tal, Danny Bar-Tal, not related. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, this was absolutely fascinating, really.
And inspiring and troubling also.
Thank you for inviting us.
Keep at it. Thanks for your good work.
Thank you very much.
By the way, if you want to read the study that Danny Bar-Tal did on Israeli and Palestinian school books, along with his Palestinian co-author, Sami Adwan, just look it up on the internet. It's really interesting. It's worth reading. Their report is called Victims of Our Own Narratives, Portrayal of the Other in Israeli and Palestinian School Books.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You can hear us on Apple or Spotify or on other major podcast sites. And you can find links to some of the major investigations we've done in books and on radio if you go to our website, tworeporters.org. I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.